Good afternoon. Welcome to Trinity United Methodist Church. My name is Toby Nguyen. I'm the pastor here at Trinity, and we are so honored to host Preservation North Carolina this year and the keynote address. A couple of housekeeping things. The bathrooms are to your left. They're on this level, so if you just wrap around this door here and around the corner, and you'll be able to find a bathroom. There are hearing assist devices out in the narthex, so out in the back of the sanctuary to your left, there will be hearing assist devices. Trinity United Methodist Church is 200 years old, and this sanctuary is very close to celebrating its 100th anniversary. It will be in 2024, was the first worship service, or 100 years from the first worship service here at Trinity United Methodist Church. The cornerstone was laid in 1923. So grateful for Nicholas, our organist, who was able to squeeze us in between law classes at Duke University. I'd like to introduce Merle Ritchie. She's our church historian. She grew up here at Trinity United Methodist Church and is quite active in Durham Preservation Society for quite a long time. Merle?
A Methodist congregation had organized in 1830 as Orange Grove Methodist Church. In the 1860s, this congregation moved into Durham and adopted the new name of Durham Methodist Church, later moving to the present site of Trinity Church. Here, a little pine church was used as a temporary hospital for Civil War wounded soldiers of both South and North. In 1880, they again took a new name when they replaced the frame building with the 1881 brick Trinity Methodist Episcopal Church South, noted for its 120-foot steeple. From 1815 to 1920, Trinity Church supported missionaries and native workers in China, Japan, Korea, Brazil, and Mexico. The brick church was completely destroyed by fire in 1923. The present church building, the third on the site, in the narthex, there's a banner that shows the three churches. So our building now is the third on the site, was designed by nationally known ecclesiastical architect Ralph Adams Cram. The pipe organ was built especially for Trinity by E.M. Skinner, a prominent nationally known organ designer. There are not too many of these Skinner organs left, having been mostly replaced by electronic instruments. It does require some upkeep. Trinity's opening service, a service of dedication was held in 1944, the entire debt of construction being repaid. By 1969, the name of the church was changed to Trinity United Methodist Church, reflecting the merger of the Methodist Church and the Church of the Evangelical United Brethren. Trinity has furnished leadership to the Methodist Episcopacy, the state of North Carolina, Duke University, and its Divinity School. This includes 3 bishops, W.W. Peel, C.J. Harrell, and Paul N. Garber, 2 governors, William B. Umstead and Terry Sanford, both having also served in the United States Senate. Terry Sanford also having served as president of Duke University. Many members have been Duke Divinity School faculty, including Deans Robert Cushman and Dennis Campbell. Trinity participates in significant local missions. In 1971, the North Carolina Conference voted Trinity the Urban Church of the Year. Since 2003, except during COVID, Trinity has held a free community breakfast every month that has 5 Sundays, and presently hosts community communion every Wednesday with lunch provided. Trinity has provided support in the form of office and meeting space, monetary contributions, and donations of all kinds, including hours of service, to various programs in Durham, including Habitat for Humanity since 1989, Narcotics Anonymous, Open Table, Welcome Baby, Interfaith Hospitality Network, Durham Congregations in Action, Crop Walk, Urban Ministries of Durham, and Genesis Home. Trinity and its members have a valued history of participation in global affairs, including mission teams following hurricanes, youth in mission projects, sponsors of Chinese and Montagnard refugees, and supporting particular foreign missionaries. Members have served as missionaries. Trinity has been called the mother of Methodism in Durham. Trinity early was interested in the development of Methodism throughout the community of Durham and its environs. In 1890, at a meeting held in Trinity Church, leading citizens, including Washington Duke and Benjamin N. Duke, began plans for Trinity College, then in Randolph County, North Carolina, to be brought to Durham. The college was moved to Durham, later becoming Duke University. Here follows a few of the capital improvements at Trinity. In 1965 and ongoing, the Mattie Toms Buchanan Memorial Garden was developed and enhanced. It's right out on this side of the church. In 1985, the steeple, originally planned in 1924, was erected with the bequest of Mrs. Henrietta Shaw Glenn and designed by architect Felix Markham IV. One word about Felix. He prepared a booklet for you, so please pick it up. This is the very same Felix who did the steeple, so if on your way out, pick up a booklet to take home from your experience here. Planning for the columbarium began in 1998 with first inurnment in 2001. The capital campaign of 2015 resulted in complete renovation of 4 main restrooms for handicapped access and modernization of plumbing, as well as refurbishing of our sanctuary lights, a major project because of sanctuary height and outdated wiring. Trinity is a United Methodist site nationally, as evidenced by the plaque on the fence out front, as well as a contributing structure in the downtown Durham Historic District. Our stained glass windows are one of the most striking features of our sanctuary. The windows were designed and installed by J. Whipple and Company, New Jersey, Wilbur Burnham Studios, Boston, and Shenandoah Studios of Front Royal, Virginia. The windows in the nave are Gothic double lancet windows. Those on the west wall, to the left entering from the narthex, depict scenes from the Old Testament. The windows on the east wall represent events in the life of Christ. Here are a few things for you to explore if you have time before leaving. On the front pew right down here are a few handouts of more detailed description of our windows. This material appears in your booklet, so if you're just interested in reading about it later, the booklet would be fine, but this, if you wanted to walk around and connect the message of the window to the window, you can do it with the handout here. Downstairs in the history nook, located just under the narthex when you came in, go down some steps back there, is a photograph collection depicting our history, including an easel showing all the churches locally developed by Trinity as the mother of Methodism in Durham. On the bulletin board near the church office in the education building are photographs of the inside of our E.M. Skinner organ and its lungs. That's in the basement. And information about the musical artist who maintains it for us, who is the curator of all Duke organs. I invite you to come forward after this session to see up close our beautiful chancel area, especially the kneelers and the carved angel altar railing. I plan to be in the narthex after this session if you have some questions, and don't forget to pick up your booklet. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the welcome and for the history to those at the Trinity United Methodist Church. This is a fascinating building. Want to thank you all. My name is Benjamin Briggs. I'm President and CEO of Preservation North Carolina. I want to welcome you. It's my honor to welcome you to the Marion S. Covington Keynote Address featuring Don Rypkema. And how nice it is to be here in Durham in Ralph Adams Cram Sanctuary to hear about the challenges that we have today across North Carolina and beyond in affordable housing and how we might address those problems. Before that, I want to thank all of our event and annual business sponsors, with special thanks to our lead business sponsor, Biltmore, and premier business sponsors, Capital Broadcasting Company, as well as Collegiate Capital Management. As a former resident of, maybe I'm a dual residency of the Triad and the Triangle, I am acutely aware of the differences that our metro areas have in affordability. And in Greensboro, many would make their position known that they were looking at living in Durham and they could not afford Durham. And they would drive west on the interstate to find a community that was like Durham, that was more affordable, and often landed in Greensboro. So in some ways, maybe Greensboro is becoming a bedroom community to Durham as this affordability crisis makes its impact across our state. And to help us in maybe solving that is Don Rypkema today. Don is a principal of PlaceEconomics, Washington, D.C. based consulting firm that specializes in measuring the economic impact of historic preservation. He's completed numerous studies across North Carolina with help from Rodney Swink, our own North Carolina Rodney Swink, senior associate in the firm. And their studies have been cited in every reputable economic development study across the state and beyond. He was educated in Columbia University, receiving a Master's of Science degree in Historic Preservation. His book, The Economics of Historic Preservation, A Community Leader's Guide, is widely used and known by preservationists worldwide. Today in Durham, he will look at older and historic buildings as the solution to the affordable housing crisis, not the cause. Cities like Durham are experiencing an affordability crisis, and Don's advice for addressing this crisis might surprise community leaders. Can we build our way out of this position? How does an internationally recognized real estate and economic development consultant with a career of analyzing comprehensive impacts of historic preservation advise us in taking action to address this crisis? Let's find out. Don, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Benjamin. Very nice introduction. I'm really happy to be here, but I have to tell you, well, first of all, you all know this, but just to reinforce it, there is no better statewide preservation organization in America than Preservation North Carolina. And of course, a little bit of the credit for that goes to my longtime friend, Myrick Howard, who, I don't know, who was fired, so I didn't know he'd even show up here, but here he is. And I also bring you greetings from Rodney, who is supposed to have lunch with me today, is not feeling so well, but former board chair here at PNC. And yeah, he retired from the state, got tired of being a bureaucrat running the state Main Street program, sat at home for a couple of years, and then I recruited him to come back and work with us. And he, Caitlin Cotton, and other of our colleagues and I just returned from a month in Australia, Kuala Lumpur, and Indonesia. So that's kind of where we spend our spare time. Also, when I drove in from the airport last night, and I was shocked at Durham. The last time I was here was for Myrick, I don't know, 15 years ago maybe, looking at the neighborhood. And I remember it being a kind of okay place, but it was kind of, I might be wrong, it was kind of down and out. Boy, it ain't true anymore. What a fabulous place. It doesn't mean without challenges, but a really wonderful place that Durham has become. So with that, One of my favorite quotations is this one from a Broadway producer. If you can't write your idea on the back of my business card, you don't have a clear idea. So here is the whole essence. You can leave after this, that we are systematically tearing down what is affordable and we're building what is not. So what I'm going to talk about today in kind of sequence is this whole thing about the affordable housing crisis nationally, and it's everywhere, that then talk about what older and historic housing is in the United States, how that housing in fact is meeting affordability needs, how preservationists feel about affordability and auxiliary dwelling units, one of the responses to affordable housing, and then some ideas for whatever they're worth for action. But starting out with some basic realities. First of all, there really is a crisis in affordable housing. This isn't like somebody's imagination or some crazy person on the left or right waving a flag. It really is. Second, it's nearly every place. Yeah, it's all over North Carolina, but it's all over the country. And relying on affordable housing programs that currently exist will not alone solve the problem. And I'll talk more about that. Again, the second thing, remember this and go home. You can't build new and rent or sell cheap. It cannot be done. It cannot be done. It cannot be done. But it's not just rent or mortgage payments. This whole issue of affordability is also affected by proximity. Proximity to work, proximity to transportation, to shopping, and to schools. And this is the last one you have to memorize and you can go home. Every time a pre-1970 housing unit is lost, a unit of affordable housing is lost. Period. Now, I picked 1970, and you're going to hear way more data than you ever wanted to hear. But I picked 1970 as the kind of benchmark for older housing because it reaches that 50-year mark. And again, 50 years doesn't mean things are historic, but 50 years is kind of the threshold that says, well, maybe we should ask if this has some historic significance. Certainly not everything built before 1970 should be, somehow designated historic, but that's the framework that you'll hear me talking about today. So those of you, raise your hand if you do not know who this person is. If you don't know. Yeah. Well, if you don't know who it is, Jack Webb is, you're too damn young. That's all I can tell you. Well, by the way, and I meant to say this, thank you, Pastor, for sharing this fabulous facility, and thank you for the history. I mean, lots of times we hear history about buildings and architects, and that's fine, but I love it when the history is also about the human beings involved in the history. That was just so wonderful to hear that, so thank you for that. So this is the old badge 714, or whatever it's called, and the dragnet, the sergeant in the LA Police Department, and always say, just the facts, ma'am. So here's just the facts. There's an issue called housing cost burden, and I'm going to talk about that, and that means if more than 30% of a household income is going for housing costs. Second, the category called severely housing cost burden means that more than 50% of the household income is going to housing costs. 49% of renter households, half of renter households are housing cost burdened, including 26% that are severely housing cost burdened. Think about that. A fourth of every renter household in America is spending 50% or more of its income just on housing. That means almost 12 million renter households are severely housing cost burdened. 73% of very low income households receive no housing assistance. So if somebody says, oh, well, we got plenty of programs to take care of those housing, not true, just is not true. The per unit cost, there's a great program, low-income housing tax credit, wonderful program, that per unit cost of creating housing units using the low-income housing tax credit range from $200,000 to $250,000, and in many parts of the country, twice that. And a quarter of 65-year-old and older households are renters. That's up from 14% 20 years ago. 73% of 20 to 34-year-old households are renters, up from 60% to 2001. So there's really a shift of both the older and the younger of, well, we can't afford to buy, we have to rent. So this issue of housing cost burdened, almost a quarter of homeowners are housing cost burdened. 10% of those are severely housing cost burdened. And again, among renters, almost half are housing cost burdened, with a quarter of them being severely so. And here's where there's a concentration of rent-burdened households. The dark area rent burden. So there's no white space at all in North Carolina. No white space at all in most of the country. So this is a widely universal issue that we're having to face. And here's the kind of patterns that set that go. So here's been the change in the last 23 years in household income. It's gone. There's the change in rent, and there is the change in home prices. So if incomes are going up, but rent and household mortgage payments are going up more, you're never going to catch up. You're never going to catch up, and this is the basic cause of the problem. And here's what it is in North Carolina. There is the income level, and there is the housing cost level. So here, once again, you're suffering from the same pattern that's happening all over the country. In fact, here in North Carolina, in the last 35 years, incomes have gone up about 186%. Housing prices gone up 275%. So it's this spread between what people are earning and what they're having to fork out as housing that's caused this universal crisis. So it's going to remain a challenge at least over the next decade. Here's why. The good news, 6 million jobs are going to be created in the next 10 years. A third of them, however, are in 3 job categories, kind of nurses, aide types, cooks, waiters, waitresses. And the median pay, a third of the jobs are going to be in those 3 categories. The median pay for those jobs, $23,000 a year, meaning they can afford $600 a month rent. Where can you find any $600 a month rent? Not very many places. So I really apologize for this, but it's the economist in me that forces me to do it. Some really basic but really geeky economics concepts. The law of demand: when the price of any product increases, then its demand will fall. When its price decreases, the demand will increase in the market. Law of demand. Law of supply says when the price of a product increases, the quantity of the product suppliers offer will increase. When its price decreases, the quantity of the product will decrease. Well, sorry, but both of those laws of supply and demand are being broken. They're just not working. Which means when demand doesn't equal supply in a market economy, what you have is market failure. The market by itself is not responding to the needs in the market. And what does that mean? Well, in a market failure, then the decisions of an individual person and the decisions of what's good for everybody go in different directions. And that's what we see is clearly happening now. And the kind of old definition of inflation, but it's certainly true in housing, is too much money chasing too few goods. And when there is a market failure, and I'm a market economy guy, I'm not some kind of crazy left-wing socialist type, but when the market doesn't work, when there's market failure, then there needs to be intervention if this kind of public interest is going to be solved, meaning that the public sector and or the nonprofit sector have to step in because the private sector by itself is not resolving the problem. Oops, sorry. So I want to talk about this issue about older and historic housing in the United States, just kind of what is it? Well, there's lots of myths about this older historic housing. One, well, it's too small to meet current needs, or it's falling down and not worth fixing. Sometimes I've heard it's only standing up because the termites are holding hands. You've heard all those things as well. And it's not what today's buyers are looking for. So that's the critique of this older housing stock. Well, just to kind of set the ground, the framework, for what we're talking about in older housing is that of all the households in America, about 31% of them are owners in pre-1970 housing, and about 14% are renters in pre-1970 housing. So that's kind of what the whole market is. And when you look at it, there's about just short of 53 million housing units that are 50 years plus, or about 37% of all housing units. So that's this body of housing that we're talking about in the older and historic housing. Now, this issue about, well, it's all fallen down, we can't save that stuff. Well, in fact, you all know about the population census. What you might not know is there's also regularly a census of housing. And here's what it is. Of pre-1970 housing, 90% of it is deemed adequate. Yeah, 5% moderately inadequate, 2% of severely inadequate, so maybe that's what has to go. But that's not, over 90% of it, in fact, is deemed to be adequate, and with modest investments would keep them in circulation. Here is the character of pre-1970 housing units. About 75% to three-quarters are single-family residences, and then a bunch in 2 to 4 plexes, smaller units, and that's where the housing is. Here is monthly housing cost. The blue numbers are for housing built after 1970. The orange numbers are the ones that built prior to 1970. So if you look at that lower end, housing cost of less than $500 a month, higher share of that older housing. And the next category, between $500 and $1,000 a month, greater share. Then you get up to $1,000 a month, and the ratios reverse, that there's more of that greater share in the newer housing. This is this affordability issue of older housing. And here is who lives in pre-1970 housing by income, and you can see what's happening is the line sloping to the right. The higher the household income, the less likely they are to live in older housing, or conversely, the lower the income, the more likely they are to live in housing. It's also true by age, that the older people are, the more likely they are to live in that older housing. So here we have two, in general, vulnerable groups who rely on this older housing to live. That is, people of very modest income and older people. And what are we doing? We're just getting rid of the housing they need to be able to survive. And then when we look at poverty level households, 37% of all households live in pre-1970 housing, but 40% of households at 50% of the poverty line, 42% of those between 50 and 99% of the poverty line. So again, this concentration of use of older housing is by people of very modest means. Who is more likely to live in pre-1970 housing? Black people are more likely. Age 65 and up are more likely. Disabled people more likely. Hispanic people more likely. Incomes under $10,000 a year more likely. And people who have been resident in the same place for over 20 years. So those are the groups that have an inclination to be in that older housing. And again, many of those groups are ones that deserve our attention. Well, there are today 4,800,000 vacant housing units built before 1970. We have this housing crisis, and yet we have 5 million vacant pre-1970 housing units, including 750,000 that have been vacant for more than 1 year. Now, the total shortage in the United States in housing is estimated to be 6.5 million units. 75% of the entire housing shortage could be addressed by occupying those vacant pre-1970 housing. Now, I do that for statistical purposes. Some of that housing is places where no people live. Some of it's in the middle of Detroit, so it's not a one-to-one relationship. But just to begin thinking about it, that if you have this older vacant housing and we have a housing crisis, housing shortage, we ought to figure out how to match those two things. Here's why we're falling behind in affordable housing units. Again, older housing disproportionately meets the needs of households of modest financial means. Great program, low-income housing tax credit, and since 1987, about 3.5 million housing units have been created using that great federal program, low-income housing tax credit. Over that same period, 11.5 million housing units built prior to 1970 have disappeared forever. Now, some of those burned down, and some of them got washed in a flood. The vast majority of those consciously torn down. They were torn down. So we're building 3.5 million. We're tearing down 11 million. We will never, ever, 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 ever catch up if that pattern continues. So that 3.5 million low-income housing tax credit units, that 11.5 million that were built before 1970 torn down, that, to put it in context, is 327,000 every year, 900 every day, 7 days a week for the last 35 years. We've torn down a unit of pre-1970 housing. And for those of us who care about the older stuff, many more likely to be considered historic, 8 million of those were built prior to 1940, so 80-year-old housing. Now we can say, well, maybe we can protect that housing from going. Maybe 6% of all the pre-1970 housing in America is protected in some form, local historic district, some other fashion. 94% of it, tear it down tomorrow. If half of the pre-1970 housing that were demolished over the last 35 years had been rehabilitated, we would have no housing shortage in the United States. Think about that. If 35 years ago we'd made the decision we want to be arbitrarily throwing stuff away, rehabbed it instead, there would be no housing shortage, period. We thought to save that older housing stock. Well, here's why this existing older structures have to be the priority for affordable housing. The average new construction cost for low-income housing tax credits, $210,000 per unit. Average cost, including acquisition of units using the low-income housing tax credit in existing buildings, $153,000. North Carolina, you're filled with elected officials who say, the only thing I care about is fiscal responsibility and saving the taxpayers' dollars. Go and tell those idiots, then this is what they ought to be doing. They ought to be saying, put the money where the cost effectiveness is, and that is reusing older and existing housing. Also, great study, wish our firm could take credit for it, but it's people way smarter than us. They looked at the life cycle costs of this affordable housing and found out that life cycle cost for new construction, that is the whole life of that unit, were $40,000 to $70,000 higher than the per unit cost of older stuff. Where's the fiscal responsibility who's not yelling on the Senate floor, save that older stuff and use that for affordable housing? The phrase is called NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing, and that is exclusively older housing. Now, however, even though reused units, acquisition, rehab is a third more cheaper, that 55 to 60% of all the projects using the low-income housing tax credit are backed from new construction. Now, by the way, think of yourself as a potential tenant in one of these. Which would you rather be living in, both low-income housing tax credit projects? Now, we're a data research firm, and most of our stuff is like you're hearing, there's large numbers, but sometimes it makes sense to look at just the little level. One of our colleagues, Alyssa Freistack, lives in Chicago in the Andersonville neighborhood, and she was just walking around her neighborhood one day and saw these three housing units, multifamily housing units. The one on the left is a kind of typical Chicago early 20th century housing thing, 3-story brick. The one in the middle was a 1966 kind of mid-century modern apartment house. The other one was a new condominium. So they are same neighborhood. So any other impact of location, anything, school district, whatever, it's all the same. The only thing here is what age they are, and here is the per square foot rent of those three things. When we get rid of the older stuff, we get rid of affordable housing. And there's the evidence from the streets of Chicago. Well, here is our response. We ought to be prioritizing these modest-sized, older and historic stuff in shotguns, bungalows, mill houses, and row houses. That's our contribution to affordable housing. And here's the prime market: 1- and 2-person households who are renters, empty nesters, and first-time home buyers. That's who we ought to be targeting with those units. And that's not a niche of the marketplace. That's most of the marketplace. That almost 30% of all households in America are 1-person households. Another third are 2-person households. So between those two, 60% of all households in America are 1- or 2-person households. Home building, thinks it's 1956 and it's Leave It to Beaver time, and they're building housing for that, 2 parents, 2 kids at home, and that ain't the American household anymore. It's 1 or 2 people who's most of the households. And that is a pattern that's going to continue to grow into the future, that 1-person household, a significant chunk. Some other things for you. 57% of first-time homebuyers purchased a house built prior to 1950. Less than 30% of first-time homebuyers bought a house built after 1999. So to say there's not a market interest in those housing is just factually incorrect. And the National Association of Realtors they have a really good research arm, and they looked at who their buyers were by age. Well, millennials were 34% of all buyers, but almost 60% of buyers of pre-1912 housing and 44% of buyers of 1912 to 1960 housing. So they're there. I mean, to say that, oh, young people, they don't care about that old stuff. No, they're buying it. They're buying it. Then this housing survey, also, American Survey of Housing, also asked people about how satisfied are you, how's your house relative to where you came from. Well, in the pre-1970 housing, a higher share say that their home is better than the previous home than do the people who lived in newer housing. And particularly important when we add transportation costs to housing costs, which is critical. The people saying that there's public transportation is good in my neighborhood, 38% in newer neighborhoods, 57% people in older neighborhoods. So it's both this older housing stock and where that older housing stock is located that adds to the affordability when we add in this transportation element. Here's why I think people are buying in older historic neighborhoods. It's the 3 C's. It's the character of the neighborhood, the character and quality, this is a place I'd want to live. It's cost, how much I can afford to pay for housing, and its convenience, the proximity to work, to transportation, to schools, and shopping. I love this. We did a study a few years ago in Miami-Dade County, and while we were doing it, this district was named in Miami. These houses are old, humble, and made of wood. They're also now historic landmarks. So a kind of city that's recognizing the value of these older resources. In fact, you've all heard about the tiny house movement. Well, the original tiny house is, in fact, lots of our historic buildings. There are 12.5 million existing pre-1970 housing, smaller than 1,000 square feet. So we have a giant inventory of tiny houses for the market. Now, preservationists, well, lots of times we view our firm, PlaceEconomics, as kind of myth busters about preservation, because there's a whole bunch of kind of conventional wisdom about what preservation is or isn't, and a lot of this deals with affordable housing, saying, oh, the stupid preservationists, they just want to save housing of rich dead white guys and they don't care about the other issues. So we have in our firm, we do it a couple times a year, what we call our Pres polls. And we have a mailing list, we use Facebook, whatever, but we get good responses of mostly people who are preservation professionals. And we had one poll on this broader issue of affordable housing to see what preservationists felt about it. And you all have taken surveys where there's this kind of measure. One end was housing affordability is not a problem in my community. In the middle point was housing affordability is a problem but not a crisis. The other end, housing affordability is a crisis point in my community. And there's what preservationists answered. Crisis point in my community was where that concentration of responses were. And then relative to the rest of the city, how affordable is housing in historic districts in your community? Well, a few said very affordable, but too many people said it's not affordable. So we have to bear some responsibility. And then we asked about tools Tools to ease the housing affordability problem. Which do you have in your community? Well, the most likely were grants for repairs. About a third of them had that, but 2/3 didn't, and that was the biggest. So we have this range of tools, and nobody has them. We asked then which tools would be most effective. Well, the top of the list was grants. A third of the people have grants. 3/4 said that'd be the effective tool, but policies encouraging retention of older housing, historic preservation revolving fund, much higher demolition fees to discourage raising, low interest costs for repairs of houses in historic districts, all of which were seen as effective tools, but nobody has them. And then what role should, if any, should preservationists be playing in addressing the issues of affordable housing? Again, at one end was preservationists should concentrate on preservation. In the middle, preservation should address affordable housing, but that would not be a primary role. And at the other end, preservation should be leading affordable housing efforts. And that's where the answer was. In fact, preservationists ought to play a major role, not just passive, a major role saying this is a problem and we preservationists have to be part of the solution. And then we also did a survey on ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units. And you probably have mixed feelings about that. We've come around in our firm to be real proponents of it. But we don't force our perspective on anybody else's, so we asked about that. So we asked, does your city currently have legislation related to ADUs? About 60%, yes, we do. Should historic districts be exempt? 80% of preservationists said no. Historic districts should not be exempt from those opportunities to build auxiliary dwelling units. When asked about the possible positive consequences, number one, affordable housing created. And then efficient use of existing building stock, increased density, multi-generational living arrangements. So a whole range of positive benefits, again, preservationists identified. And then we asked about negative consequences, and the top one, used for short-term housing rather than permanent residence. And then parking problems and increased traffic. What is your personal opinion on allowing ADUs? Again, these professional preservationists, strongly in favor, strongly in favor. So this idea that somehow preservationists are trying to stop that or against affordable housing initiatives or, only concerned with gargoyles and cornices, it just ain't the case. So some responses to consider. I don't want to call them recommendations. They are what they are. But here's some of them. The importance of creating small programs for maintenance. One of our favorite and ongoing repeat clients is the city of San Antonio. They have really a great historic preservation office. And in San Antonio, they have a program called Under One Roof. And here's the premise. What's the biggest threat to houses? Water. Where does water come from? The roof. So what do we need to do? Fix the roof. So they have this real simple, straightforward program. We'll give you $10,000 to fix your roof. Limited to older houses and people of modest resources. Here's $10,000, fix the roof. Now, some of the city council members said, well, yeah, but what if the foundation is crumbling and what if the councilman whose bill this was said, I don't care. The fact is we can keep people living in that house if we just fix the stupid roof. And then they have a minor repair program about $25,000 a unit. And then weatherization grants. Again, a big cost is not just the rent or the mortgage payment, but paying the utility bill. And if we can intervene with some weatherization things, we make the existing house where somebody lives, in fact, more affordable for them. The other thing I think is important is this analysis that was done by the National Institute of Building Sciences, that when you defer repairs, you may end up paying 15 times as much to make those repairs. Demolition should cost more. Look, if demolition of older homes is exacerbating the affordable housing needs, and it is, and if demolition has negative environmental consequences, and it does, then when it happens, it should be lots more expensive, unless there's a deconstruction ordinance. Again, you probably have mixed feelings. We no longer have mixed feelings about deconstruction ordinances. Now, that it's the last resort. You'll look at other things. Do we keep the house? Can we repair the house? Can we move the house? But when all of those, sometimes all of those options are off the table, then we ought to be deconstructing the house, reusing those materials, turning those materials into assets for other owners of older houses to use, for low-income housing creators to use those things, all kinds of benefits, including job creation from deconstruction. Oops. Then mitigation fund for demolition, whether or not it's an historic district. Now, many of you know about the federal 106 process for federal programs. If the state highway department is widening a road in North Carolina, there's going to have an analysis if any historic resources are being harmed by that. And if the conclusion is there is, then the highway department either has to change the road or more likely come up with a mitigation for that. Pay some money to do something else. We ought to do that for demolition. If you're demolishing a house, then put some money in the kitty to create more affordable housing, to fix roofs. I don't care what you do with it, but if you're tearing down stuff, there ought to be a mitigation fund that you have to pay into. And then code enforcement policy. Too many cities, including many of those that have strong preservation ethic on this side of the table, will at that side of the table have the building inspection department says, oh, we got to tear that stuff down, that's no good, it's public danger, blah, 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 blah. And so we need to change that. We need to change that. It's the default response far too often. We ought to be thinking about, well, if it's deteriorating, should we acquire it by the city and do something with it? Should we reuse it? Should we give some rehabilitation assistance? Should we convey it to a nonprofit or a housing authority? Again, when a house is raised, a unit of affordable housing is lost. Just stick that in your head. Every time you see something being torn down, we're losing a unit of affordable housing, period. For those of you who deal with National Register stuff, there's an increasing number of multiple resource National Register districts where maybe all the churches in the city or all the Masonic temples or all the whatever. Well, we ought to think about doing that on the local level, particularly to shotguns, bungalows, mill houses, row houses, whether or not they're in a confined geographical area, designate them to give them some protection because that's a response to affordable housing. And then we need, again, some of you are going to disagree, and I'm happy for that. We need to think about our design guidelines and our regulations more fit to the housing that's there. I think as the time has passed, where we all say, oh, we got the Secretary of Standards, all we need. Well, you know what? Mount Vernon is not the same as a bungalow in Durham. It's not. And to have kind of the same set of standards is just idiocy. We need to rethink that all. When we create a new historic district, we ought to simultaneously create a new affordable housing overlay district. Now, a lot of our work is kind of impact analysis, but some of it is policy recommendation mostly to city governments. And this is a recommendation that we have consistently added. We don't even know what that means, except it's saying that if you create a new historic district, you ought to focus all of the tools you have in the city, whatever those are, on that district. So you simultaneously saying, we're protecting the historic resources, but we're bringing into play whatever tools we have to preserve affordable housing. Cities ought to just bite the bullet, and when there is an older, vacant house, buy it. Buy it and stabilize it. And I don't care what you do with it. Give it away. Give it to the housing authority. Give it to a nonprofit. Sell it to someone. I don't care what you do with it. When you have a unit of older housing sitting vacant, buy it and do something if you're serious about addressing affordable housing. And maybe you should have a city that has a first right of refusal on every pre-1970 property. So whenever one comes up for sale, the city at least has the option to buy it. Now they're going to say, no, it's too expensive, or no, that doesn't fit, or whatever, but at least to have that built in so cities are thinking about how do we keep this housing that's providing affordability. I think we ought to encourage auxiliary dwelling units. It can provide a unit of affordable housing. It can make, importantly, it can make the existing property owner more affordable for the house they're living in. And in historic districts really can be designed so there's kind of a minor impact on the character of the neighborhood. I have to tell you, we've done studies in New York City and Los Angeles. Great organizations, both the New York Conservancy and the LA Conservancy. New York Conservancy says, yeah, we don't want to be promoting that ADU stuff. That's not for us. LA people are taking the other end. The state legislation in California basically said, you can't have single-family dwelling. Anybody has to be able to put an ADU. So instead of fighting it all, the preservationists in Los Angeles said, let's encourage it in historic districts because we then have a way to control the character and the impact that that ADU would have on the neighborhood. And there can be lots of examples where there's not a significant adverse impact on the character of the neighborhood. It adds density without changing the human scale, and it creates a great opportunity for small-scale developers and contractors. I hate to say it when we're in such a wonderful church. My experience is that the big villains in urban neighborhoods are not developers. They are churches, hospitals, and schools, colleges, who tear down housing for Porsches for professors and proctologists. Well, if that's going to happen, and I understand, they say we need new doctor's offices, we need new college, whatever. Institution, mowing down housing, no more. You got to relocate that house. Find a lot, pick up the house, move it there, so that unit of affordable housing. Don't be telling me that your endowment won't let you pay for that. Not true. Frequently unchallenged. Because they all say, oh yeah, but what we do, we're not taking profits, we're doing it for the good of the community. Well, in your doing good for the community, you're often wrecking the community. You ought to be held accountable. Require those relocation, those houses. Airbnbs. Now, the original intent of Airbnbs, I think, is great. So I got a little carriage house, and so I rent that, or I got a spare bedroom, I put a, great. That is not what they have become. They have become horizontal motels, and somebody owning 10 or 15 or 35 units. That is not the intent, and that has a huge adverse impact on affordability. There's no better example of that than New Orleans. The one positive outcome of Katrina, because so many people left, is housing was really, really affordable in New Orleans. No longer the case. Why? Because of Airbnbs. And again, people renting, visiting a city, they don't want to live in stay in some boring neighborhood. They want to live in a great historic neighborhood, so this disproportionate burden of Airbnbs are on the neighborhoods that you are working to save. So some general conclusions. Housing affordability is real and it's serious. It's going to get worse. The existing older housing stock is providing much of what is affordable housing. Most of that is totally, there's no subsidies, no incentives, no assistance, just there. Just because it's there, it still exists, it's providing affordability. That housing is being lost at a very rapid pace. Now, new construction certainly has to be part of the solution, but that's neither going to be cheap nor is it going to be sufficient. As much of the existing older housing stock as possible has to be maintained. And we have insufficient tools to retain those older housing. So making the retention of older housing as the central element in affordability housing strategies would put North Carolina at the forefront nationally. Thank you all very much. So we have 5 minutes for questions, comments, alternative views, or go back to Washington, you communist. Any of those are perfectly appropriate things. Yes, sir. I'll be happy. Thank you. Thank you for asking. I'll be happy to convert it into a PDF, give it to PNC, and they can distribute it however they want. Happy to do that. Yeah. Great. Yes. Yeah, no, we make up stuff. We try to cite examples when there are some, but half the time we come up with stuff nobody's tried it before. So, the best of my knowledge, there isn't an example. But you could be the first. Yeah. Land banks. Well, a couple things on that. I think land banks have the opportunity to be saviors. They operate very differently in different cities. One of them that really operates well is in Cincinnati, and their land bank consciously goes to acquire older housing and keeping it, and doing something with it, fixing it up, turn it over, whatever. While other places say, yeah, we're a land bank, we're not a housing bank, so we'll buy stuff and mow everything down. Well, they're just exacerbating the problem. But since you brought that up, there is another tool that I think everybody ought to be looking more closely at, and that is community land trusts. It's a tool where, in oversimplified fashion, usually a nonprofit, it could be a city, acquires a property and then sells the house to a family, to whomever, keeps the land. When that house, the property is ready to be sold, they can sell it off, but the land stays. And so that land ownership means you can prevent demolition. You can also limit, lots of them will limit, you can make some money selling your house, but that be a zillion%. And it's a really effective tool that more places ought to be trying. And again, I said that cities ought to just acquire every vacant, pre-1970 housing, put it in a land trust. Then you don't want cities to be in the biggest property owner in the city. Sell the houses back over and let a nonprofit own that land to have some control over what happens in the future. Yeah?
How do you intervene earlier in the disrepair process?
Well, yeah, if you didn't hear it, the question was how do you intervene early enough? And that is honestly a problem. If people had intervened in Durham when Myrick first sent me over here for something, they could have bought a whole bunch of stuff, put it in a community land trust, and kept a lot of affordable houses. One of the really good, well-intentioned community land trusts is in Flagstaff, Arizona, but the woman who runs it, I saw her a year ago probably, she said, the trouble is it's just so damn expensive, we can't buy anything anymore. So we just have to figure out how to do that. But you gotta intervene early on and systematically, because if you just wait for the market to carry it, you too are gonna be kind of priced out of the market. Yeah. Yeah, the question was about what often is called inclusionary zoning, so that when you build 20 units apartment, you have to set aside 4 of them or something to be affordable housing. It is a tool, sometimes appropriate, sometimes not. I don't think it's one we should necessarily dismiss out of hand, but there's lots of complications in it. Including effectively what you're doing, I mean, just to be perfectly honest, especially if we're building a new unit, well, what you're doing is moving the burden for providing affordability to the other 16 units in the apartment. You're shifting that responsibility, not on the public in general, or the landlord doesn't do that. It shifts to those other units being either rented or sold, and there's some issues, I think, of equity of that. Kind of who should carry the burden. I think that's the question. I don't think it should be dismissed out of hand. It's just can't be the only tool we're looking at. Uh-huh.
And the problem, and I don't know if you'll know the answer to this because it's kind of a legal question, but apparently they can't save houses. This is what I've been told. They can't save the house because there's some kind of divorce between the land and the building that sits on it, so they have to demolish it, is what have you heard of this before?
No, and Macon, by the way, is one of the other is one of the best local preservation organizations in the country, Historic Macon Foundation. Yeah, I mean, I can at least conceive, and there's lawyers in the room can answer it better than I, conceive of a situation where there's been this division between land and improvements in terms of ownership. But I don't necessarily get why that would require the demolition of the property. Like, who's demolishing? Is it the city? Ah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't know either. I mean, it's a tax foreclosure. I own the land, I'm not paying my taxes, the city has the right ultimately to take the property. It's fine, I'm all for that. But why then that requires the demolition? Because somebody else might own the house. And so whatever value there is, if they say the only thing we can do is demolish, take somebody else's assets. If I were the lawyers for the homeowners, I'd be suing the city, saying, "You're not tearing down my house." They deal with those people. There's no inherent reason. But what you bring up, however, is another kind of related issue that sometimes needs resolution. And sometimes the ownership patterns of a house are so screwy that nobody can make a decision. That there's 92 cousins that own it, and 92 want to sell, and 3 of them don't, and 1 wants to live in it and stuff. So there has to be a equitable but resolution to that, because then what happens ultimately is properties just decline. The best form of historic preservation is occupancy. And too often we just lose occupancy when we have those weird kind of title things. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that. It just sounds weird to me. Time for one more.
Examples of other cities who are doing a good job in what you're proposing nationwide?
Nobody's doing a good enough job. I think that in different fashions, I think that San Antonio is doing a good job. Phoenix, actually, this is going to sound like me bragging. No, it's mostly me saying nobody pays attention to me. Is when there was the huge financial crisis in 2008 to 2012 or so. I would sit at podiums like this and say, cities, you don't want to be foreclosing on people, but foreclosures are going to happen in this market. You ought to be going to banks who don't want to be in the real estate. They want to be getting out of that stuff. They're going to foreclosing. You ought to buy every foreclosed property and put it in your housing stock, then resell it wherever you want to do it. Well, nobody paid attention to me, but Phoenix did it. I wish I just could claim the credit. So I think now it's only 350 or 400 houses they did it with, but there's 300 or 400 houses that kind of stayed in the affordability category. And you know, the poor person who got foreclosed on was out one way or the other, but at least to put that house back in circulation out of them. And then banks are eager to do it, so they probably bought them at 50 cents on the dollar because the banks just wanted to get rid of the stupid things. But I don't think there are too many places, actually. They're doing a really good job. Everybody's kind of, you know, sweating over it, but in terms of coming up with real solutions, I don't think that many are. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Don, and I hope we're all inspired and can do more things in North Carolina. I know I'm a renter of an auxiliary dwelling unit. I live in the attic of a carriage house in Raleigh. That's the way I am able to afford that. And I'm going to call out Chris Laws here in Preservation Durham, who has a really innovative program that he is proud of that has provided small grants to provide elders to remain in historic housing. He keeps, I'm going to brag on him a little bit, he keeps on his phone a little recording of a message left by one of the women that they repaired her bathroom and her kitchen floor and painted the walls, and she was so proud of her house and that it looked so good. So, right here in Durham, Chris Laws is doing the work that we're talking about. So maybe we can all go out and be inspired and network and share ideas amongst each other on how we can all address historic preservation and affordable housing.